How many people in here have a production version of SharePoint in play? 2010? 2013? New? Okay. All right, well, I'm just going to jump through. Hey, Dave. Dave, you want me to limit this to 3.5 hours, right? I'm just teasing. I got a couple slides just to talk about the architecture, which has changed quite a bit in 2013, and then we'll do some demos. So before this release, Microsoft kind of had a data-centric focus with SharePoint. The idea being that things were organized around lists and libraries and sites and pages and so forth. There's been a major effort now in 2013 to change that focus to be more people-centric. I think this next term I'm going to use, I think it's probably the wrong term, but it's one that everybody uses. There's been a major investment made in social networking, and I've been around a lot of business people, and I've heard them say things like, well, I'm not going to spend my money to have people put their baby pictures up on my server. And it's really not about that. It's really about productivity and connectivity, because human beings are social, and we're going to talk to one another, and we're going to network to one another. And by having electronic tools in place, that enables us to do that. So a couple things I'll go over here. This is me. This is a little bit of an eye chart, but I think a lot of people think that SharePoint is this massive, big application that only the big guys run, and that's not true. There's free versions of SharePoint, has been for several releases, and there is in 2013. All you need is a licensed copy of Windows Server 2008 R2 or newer, and everything else is in the download. In fact, you can download SQL Server 2012, you can download 2013 Enterprise and run it for 6 months fully featured. That's Microsoft's version of crack. They figure when you get it, you're not going to let it go. But you can scale it. So I think Galen said to me, well, I've got this company I'm working with. They're too small. They only have 15 users. I'm going to give you a little slide here in a minute on a business case for search, which has been dramatically enhanced in this release. And I'll throw it out to you, and you just tell me if you think it's right or not. But each one of those little boxes can be an all-in-one server, or you can scale it. So you can start modestly. You can start in the cloud and grow. The sad thing is that about 2 months ago, a study came out. We think there's in excess of 150 million seats of SharePoint that have been sold. Since there is a free version, it's probably roughly double that. Of the people that have purchased the licensed SharePoint, only about a third of them do anything other than document management. So I'm going to show you a couple things tonight that hopefully will plant a couple seeds. Don't know if you saw this on Tuesday. This has nothing to do with SharePoint, but has everything to do with IT. Intel announced the 4th generation of their i-Series chip. And those two things in the middle there, 9 hours of battery life on an x86 chip. That's pretty significant. 6 hours of continuous runtime doing something like HD video. Coming soon to a computer near you, I think. Secondly, the Atom chip is being re-released this fall. So we'll probably have $200 to $300 Windows 8 RT tablets in the Kindle price range. So kind of going to have an interesting environment here in the near term. If you go out to the Microsoft site, you'll find there's a bunch of slides and articles out there about what you need to run 2013. I have generally found that these guidelines are inaccurate. Microsoft's obviously trying to, get their product out in the marketplace. But the cheapest thing you can do for the most performance generally is memory. If you want to run an all-in-one production environment, the new best practice recommendation is 24 gig of RAM. That's quite a bit different from 2010, and I'll show you why in a minute. As I mentioned, you can download SQL 2012 Service Pack 1 for free. You can download SharePoint 2013 for free, run them for 6 months. And it's a good way to kind of spin up a virtual machine and see if it fits you or what you're trying to do. The semi-good news is the price went up. Microsoft says that so many people are consuming content off servers now that they've had a big revenue hit on the front end. There's a lot of iPads, Nexus, etc. devices. And as Microsoft moves SharePoint more into a heterogeneous environment, there's going to be a lot more things on the front end. But the good news is that if you use a lot of the features that are built into Server or Enterprise, and that's a big if, but if you do, it's cheaper. For example, how many people in here use InfoPath in a production environment? Let me see. How many people in here use InfoPath for a codeless solution? All right, how many people use InfoPath with C# code embedded in it? You're the first one that I've done that. First person that's actually said that. So you can take InfoPath, and in the past, we would have to deploy something like Office Pro Plus that had all the components in it to run on InfoPath in the client. If you have Enterprise, you have 1 or 2 copies of the InfoPath Designer. You can then publish that to the back end and run it in a browser, literally. The same is true with report services. So it cuts down your licensing cost on the front end, and that's the trend they say going forward. So big deal is now anonymous users do not have to be licensed. Now this is just me. You know, I know nothing more than you do. But I think they're this is the first big step in trying to get SharePoint positioned to be a true web platform out in the web space, out in the public web space, because the tool set's pretty rich. Let me step in here. You do need a modern version of SQL, which is 2008 R2 or higher. If you're going to do a trial, 2012 is a lot better. So let me step over into the session we have running here. Make sure I've still got a wireless here. The reason I'm running remote is it's a bit more difficult with 2013 to get a standalone all-in-one environment running on a laptop. It wants to authenticate to start a lot of the services you might spin up on the back end. So I'm going to pop over here to this virtual machine we have running on our network. And we're running 2012. And let me bring up this browser. Anybody in here running Windows 8 production? What do you think? Good? Bad? Terrible? Yeah, it's. Let's put a consumer face on our server. I like it. I really do. I've been running it since late August, and the operating system is really seems to me to be really solid. Oh yes, I agree. But the start button will soon be here. No, I mean, here's the philosophy. I was at a training session. Here's what I heard. We want to have a single code base so that we can move these components around freely, and you can as a customer. And this is kind of lame, but it is something I heard somebody from Microsoft say. But what if you're out at dinner and you have a service problem and all you have is a touch-enabled phone or tablet and you need to get on that server and do something? So now you'll have this touch-enabled device that you can RDP into. I'm not sure that I would want to do that necessarily, but I think they're trying to react to Apple and Android, and they're still in the learning process. Not many. I have a client I've done some work for who's pretty unhappy with Apple. They're a media company, and they went out and brought a lot of those high-end media workstations. And now, 2 years back, Apple decided they're not going to do it anymore. So they got this major investment. And of course, the big bucks is not in what you buy, it's in the training and the people. So this is 2013. Now in this, I have 2 virtual machines I'm running here because I do different things in them. It's a little trickier to set it up. But this is what web designers call a pixel-perfect layout, which means that you could edit this in Drupal or Dreamweaver, and it'll work just the same as if you did it in Expressions Web. Does everybody know that Microsoft stopped selling the Expression Studio in December? So now on SharePoint Designer 2013, which we're going to look at here in a minute, the best practice is not to use that to do any page layout, page edit. Download the free tool called Expressions Web and do your page layout in that or in one of these other tools. Use Designer for a couple of other tasks like workflows and so forth. So one of the things that I think is significant from a design point of view is this new app architecture. If I can get over here. Since I'm the admin, I'm going to be able to pop into this. And everything is now an app. And if I look at what's in my site here, you'll see that we have a couple of things that are not out of the box. There's now a store that's associated with SharePoint. So now we have 2 major platform decisions that we can make when we deploy apps. There's the JavaScript side, and now in Visual Studio 2012, anybody write code in here? Okay, there's now, JavaScript's a full-fledged client now. You can use a debugger and all the Visual Studio tools. It understands IntelliSense for JavaScript. So it's going to be interesting to see what shakes out. So like the info path thing we talked about, that's going to execute and render server-side. So only pages get displayed at the client. So if you had, say, 300 people, and maybe 40 of them are working remotely, it's going to be an interesting decision business-wise to see, should I have the things that I'm already used to using deployed, server-side code, or should I buy or write new things to run client-side? I can see that the larger you are, the more advantage there's going to be to run things client-side. But we were just talking about this, us old guys, me, about how much things have changed. There's never been a better time to buy hardware. Really. I mean, it's ridiculous how powerful the things are. I learned a new word yesterday, zettabyte. I had no idea there was something about petabytes that people are really doing. Your tax dollars at work out in Utah. For real. So anyhow, when you look at this, you'll see here that I have this red icon. And if I wanted to install an app from the store, I'm going to pop into this little icon here and add an app. And you'll see now we have this link here. Now this is a little tricky, I think, to get running. And you said you had 2013 running over there, right? Do you have the App Store up? If you use any docs, the docs that I used that were written before April 30th are wrong. So there's a little trick you have to do, because you have to set up a faux or fake DNS zone, because every time an app runs, it creates a unique, globally unique ID and attaches it to that fake zone so it can render properly. But let me step through here and see if we can look at a couple. I think I'm having a little technical difficulty here, Galen. There we go. So there's quite a few apps already published out here, and I think this is going to be really significant. We're a small company by design, wannabe, and I've never really done in this company, which is 20 years old, I've really never done package software, because it means I'd have to have more staff. And I have a hard enough time managing me. It's just three of us. But now, if I figure out something useful, I can publish it up here. I can make it affordable or do it for free to get publicity or whatever. And what that's going to do, it's going to expand our choice, and it's going to lower the cost, because it's going to bring a lot more developers into the workspace, because the people that have traditionally sold packages, they had to have a lot more staff. They had to have somebody go out and sell it. You had to get more money for it. If you're charging more money for it, you had to sell it to people that had more users, et cetera, et cetera. So now you're going to be able to do all that. And let me go back and show you that app. And I've downloaded 2 free ones here. And I'll show you this funky looking URL. So this is just a simple little RSS feed type app. As you can see, by topic or whatever. And what's interesting about this is, look at this URL. Can you see that in the back? All right, so now what happened was we created a DNS zone that was based off of our local DNS. And we added a wildcard zone called Infotronics apps.local. We then went into SharePoint and we told SharePoint, hey, when we run the App Store, we're going to use that as the back end, and we're going to use apps for the front end, and it created a unique ID there you see in the middle. The reason for that is because you can now have your own store. So depending on your size, you might buy some apps, you might write some apps, whatever, and you can spin up your own SharePoint store, and people can now load it on a tablet or a phone or whatever when they're out and about, provided you have put the things in place for it to do that. So questions on that? Clear as mud? Go ahead. I'm going to answer your question with a question. I have sat in so many licensing classes from Microsoft, and in virtually every one of them, the trainer has said something like this: "We've heard your feedback, and we have made it a lot easier." I don't know. I don't know. It's like there's a lot of debate about, somebody asked me the other day, well, if I have, with 2013, if I have people that work with me, but they're not part of my company, and I want to put 2013 on premise, do I license them? And what I do is I just call up Ingram Micro or wherever, whenever we have a need, and I put it in their lap because I don't know. I mean, it's just that complicated. Anybody else? Another big change in 2013 is the workflow engine. If you've been working with, you still hear me okay? Okay. Can you hear me? If you've been working with SharePoint for a while, you've noticed that over the last several releases, that gradually Microsoft ratcheted down more and more what you can do on the server with various tools. Workflow is one of those. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe somebody wrote a workflow and it took 100,000 people down or something. But it's getting more and more restrictive. So when you set up workflow in 2013, I want to show you a couple little things that are a little tricky, and then we'll do one. So the virtual machine I'm going to show you on has all these components in it. When you do testing, which we traditionally have done, we do development, we typically spin up a virtual machine. We have an all-in-one environment that we can write code on. That's the way we work. Well, now you have to have at least 2 clients. You have to have 2 user accounts. When you install SharePoint, as probably everybody knows, you're going to have a farm account. It's the most privileged account. You cannot run workflows into the farm account on the server now. So you're going to need 2 accounts. You're going to need a lot of RAM if you're going to have a hosted environment that does a lot. And now the environment's different. In 2010, workflows executed, and there's 2 major branches in the workflow tree. Visual Studio is heavier lifting. SharePoint Designer is scripting or declarative based. Designer is the more popular tool because you can do a lot of very productive things very quickly and get a lot of value up quickly. But it didn't have a lot of things like it couldn't talk to web services easily. You'd have to write stuff for it. It didn't have any conditional logic in it. Didn't have branching or looping, any of those kinds of things. Well, now it does. But if you want to run a 2013 style workflow, as you see the chart on the right, it's going to run like a server outside of the SharePoint workspace. If you write a 2010 style workflow, it runs as it did before inside the SharePoint workspace. There's a bunch of patches out there if you decide to play with this, and the sequence you install them in is important. But there's a thing called Workflow Manager that you need to install that creates that software server. And this is important. You have to tell SharePoint where that Workflow Manager is. So let me show you what we can do with that. So I'm going to log out of this server. We set up an environment where we could actually do an approval workflow. So let me pop over there. And let me RDP over to the other server. Now you notice I'm signing in as another user here. And let me bring up SharePoint. So I'm going to minimize this for a second, and let's get rid of this guy. And bring up the SharePoint interface. So we set up this list, and in this list, this is up on the SharePoint Designer Development Team blog is this example. Unfortunately, it's not complete. They do half a loaf, so you have to kind of hack it to get it to work. I don't know why they did that, but it's really a good illustration of some of these new features and how you can take some pretty simple things and create a lot of additional functionality for users to make the system a lot easier to use. I guess everybody knows that when you load up the web server, it's on demand. So if it hasn't been running for a little bit, it's creating all the cache pages it thinks we need. So we created this site called Events. And I want to create an event ID. So I'm going to create a new item. And let's say CITPG2. And this is 1117 South Boulevard. What's the zip here, Galen? 28203? And we'll say it's today.
Did you want CIPTG 1 or 2?
I wanted 2, thank you. You can come on up here and do this. I'll sit down and watch it. Yeah, I can't spell either. So I've created this event. So previously we went out and we created this workflow, so I'm going to run it and then we'll step through it. So here's my event. Right here. I'm going to pop the ellipsis down, go over to the workflow tool, and I'm going to run this manual workflow. So now, well, the first thing you'll notice, which if you've done any development work, I really like, is we now have these stages, and based on the stage that the workflow is in, it gets surfaced here in the browser. So you can kind of see what's going on. And now you'll see that it said, okay, it's in the stage called Request Approval. And let me minimize this guy. So this approval workflow created a task for me. And I didn't have time to set this up properly. But what we normally do is we normally set up a DNS zone when we run on premise that is the same URL that we use externally. The reason for that is right here. I did not do that, so I'm going to have to get back on the server and execute this task manually. So if I clicked on this link, yes, I know what time it is. If I clicked on this link that says CITPG2, it's going to try to go, we're not on the network, and it's going to try to go to that network and resolve that address, and it's not going to work. So, but anyhow, this approval workflow is sent to me, so I'm going to get back on the server, and I'm going to pop down again to the task that we were on, go into my workflow, and you'll see that this is a currently running workflow. And there's a task generated to me, CITPG2. And normally we would have just clicked on the link inside the email. I'm going to edit this. And this is a template. This is really easy to do. I'm going to approve this. And so now if we go back to the top of our task, here in a minute, now you see it's notify user. So if I bring up the email client, this went to the user. This is the user's email. And I'm going to step you through this and show you how this works. So there's two web services out on the web that we previously set up an account with. One is called Free Weather Online, and the other is Virtual Card. So we used a simple script command that we populated, and we gave it the two addresses we had and the dates, and we asked for data for the weather for the next 5 days for the location of the event. When it came back, it put it into something called a dictionary object. You know, in the past, in 2010, if I wanted to get the first name, middle initial, last name, company, etc., inside of Designer, those are all individual items, individual problems. We can now refer to all of those with one title. It's a dictionary item.
TV can't hear me. The TV can't hear you if you walk away from the website. They can hear you, but the video won't.
I'm sorry about that bad habit. I'm not Italian, but I probably should be. Yes, sir.
We're going to get 6 months rain tomorrow?
I didn't say it was right. I'm just telling you what's out there. I live in Waxhaw. I think we got 6 inches of rain yesterday. Can you hear me in the back, Robert? Okay, so I set up these accounts, right? And I said, I want 5 days, and I want these elements to come back to me. So we now have in Designer something called a dictionary object. So it grabs this huge block of data and it brings back something called JavaScript object notation, or JSON. And let me show you that. Is this going to mess with this now? You turned it off? So what does that look like? If I go down here and look at this data, this is what it gave me back. Now, that's not very useful. So I'm just going to grab this. I'm going to go into this free tool so I can kind of get a look at the data. I'm going to paste it in there, and I'm going to format it. Now, if we step through this data, you will see there on the weather, now this is from a while back, I've got date, precipitation, max temp, etc. So what that did back over in our email was it built this table. 5 days, max temp, min temp, precipitation, we think, wind speed and direction, and then down here another web service that took the data from our list, passed it into that web service, and brought it back. So let's take a look at how that works. This is SharePoint Designer 2013. And if you want to do 2013 style workflows, after you install the Workflow Manager and the Service Bus, which are add-ons, free add-ons off the Microsoft site, when you go to do a new workflow, if it's right, you're going to see it here. If you don't see 2013 here, it's not right. So we use this workflow right here. And let's take a look at it. Now, in the last release, there was an effort made to have a graphical representation. And it was a good effort, but it was kind of half a loaf, you know, the Visio Designer thing. It kind of really didn't work too well, candidly. Now it does. And the idea behind it has a lot of business value. If accounts payable comes to me and says, hey, we need a workflow to route these invoices when they come in so that we can kind of classify them correctly. I don't know anything about accounts payable. They've forgotten more about it than I'm ever going to know. So I have to spend a lot of time to find out what they're doing. And I have to reduce that to what we all know, set of requirements, and we set a scope and so forth. All that's taken a lot of time. So now what we can do with a bit of training is we can introduce those people to this tool, which does require Visio. So I'm inside Designer. I'm running the visual representation of my workflow. And you'll see that we have all these graphical tools over here that we can train people what they mean. So somebody in accounts payable, they know that when an invoice comes in, there's certain things they have to do to it, certain people that have to be involved, etc. They can give us a little diagram. And then we can just do this with the diagram. We can go back over here and we can populate it. So you'll see here that inside of Designer and the text view, I don't know why they didn't do this before, truthfully, but this made me so happy. We now have cut and paste inside of Designer. I don't know why we didn't have it before, but we didn't. So you'll see that we have these stages here. And I went out and set a couple of variables up to get the current ID, and then I just ran this template. And I just populated this approval template. Very simple. We could run this serially, which if we had 3 people in the approval chain, we could have groups. And what we typically do when we do this kind of thing is we set up a SharePoint list, and it'll be like a 2-column list. And we'll have like the function name, like supervisor, manager, accounting. And then we'll populate it with a people picker for the person that goes with that title. So then we can associate multiple lists together inside of here so that it doesn't break our workflow when people move around. You know, the supervisor could change, but the function doesn't. But I didn't do that here to make this a little faster to get up. But if we had 3 people in this chain, the first person gets the approval workflow notice like you just saw in my email. If I did not approve it and there were 2 or 3 people behind me, they'd never see it unless we coded it into the workflow. Unless when there was a rejection or something, we wanted to grab that data and notify people. Then if that did happen and it did get approved in person number 2, number 3, and so on. You can also run them parallel, which means everybody gets noticed at once. And there's code that you can incorporate here declaratively so that 1 out of 3 people approve it, it's approved or whatever. I'm just going to open up this little task option here. We said create a user task. Wait until something happens before you move to the next thing. Let's look at the email. Have a little email editor. You can use this button here to go grab data from either the task that was generated or from the current item itself and put more data in here. So we generated this email. And then we sat right here and we waited until we got an action. When it was approved, we just put this little loop in here to show you that you do have now transition stages. And it said go to approve. And in approve, we said go to get weather. Now here's where the goodness is. This is a script command. We just have to fill this sucker out. And you'll see that we're just passing through a URL, the location, and down at the end here is the key they gave me. So I'm just passing it in, and I'm telling it what I want. I'm using an HTTP GET method.
And I'm saying, give me 5 days worth of data. And they brought it all back and put it in this thing over here. This dictionary object here, you see WS response. So now I know that we have a block of data, but I know that if I give that to the user the way it came in, they're going to shoot me. So I've got to format it. So I use the script command, and I make a simple binary or long script item, and I populate it with a little bit of simple markup. I know I'm going to need an HTML table, so I said make me a table and start a table row. Then I know I'm going to have to step through a bunch of data, so I set up an index. Then I know that I'm going to need a header, right? I'm going to need a header at the top of the table. Remember from the email, it said date, max temp, min temp. So we took what we had before in that email table, and by including it here, we're adding to it. We're saying table detail is date, table detail max temp, so on. So now we have our header row, and we just have to simply step through it. So you see here we said, well, we now want to go out, give me the data based on that index pointer that had the data weather key, and give me the date. So go retrieve that from that block of data with the index and those keys, that named pair key, and put it in this thing over here called temp string. And then we came back and added temp string, and we stepped through all 7 data items times 5 rows. Am I losing you guys on this? Is this making sense? Kate tells me that geeks have this problem. Like they tell you 10% of what's in their head, and they assume you know the other 90. I guess it's a curse of some sort. So after we step through all 5 rows, we close the table. So now we have that table variable. Then we send an email. And we send an email with that table. And then we set up the second one. And this is the virtual Earth one. And you'll notice here, we passed in the location event address and the home address. And that gave us this. What do you think? Useful? You're looking for an old dude with a boat, right? Absolutely. In fact, that template, you can set a reminder in there, how many you want to send, and how frequently. All in the template. Yeah, you can change that, and you can put that in the workflow. This is a simple one, but they have ones that are more complex, and it generates a bunch of script, and you can go in there and modify the script. We've done, for a manufacturing company, we did an ISO application. And we did have to write some stuff in Visual Studio because the limitation of this is, let's say I had a task list, and every morning I wanted something to wake up and go through the task list and tell me everything it's due in the next 48 hours. This can't do that. You have to do it because this doesn't understand that kind of, there's no command that allows me to step through a list like that. We used to be able to fake it out. And like I said, Microsoft's been getting more restrictive. We used to be able to fake it out in 2007. We could set an automatic workflow on another list. And when we ran, we updated an item in the other list, and we told that list to update this item, and you could kind of get that. But I think somebody did something. It took a bunch of people down because they stopped that a ways back. But yes, you could do that. But you can't do those kinds of things. Anybody else? No. Did you hear that? He said, are these same features each available online? No. There's several deployment options with SharePoint. I think everybody knows that. You can run on-prem. That's going to give you the highest fidelity to the full feature set in the enterprise stack. You can run a dedicated server in the cloud, and that's the same thing as being on-prem, except your server somewhere else. It's your machine. Then you can run what's called multi-tenant. And when you run multi-tenant, which Office 365 is and a bunch of hosting companies do, the feature set's going to be restrictive. And it makes sense when you think about it, because it's not just you. So if you do something stupid and you break it, or maybe you probably wouldn't do something stupid, but I would, and you break it, then you're not just affecting your users, you're affecting a bunch of people. So they're going to make you run in a sandbox, and they're going to strip out some of the features. I have cloud services, and I believe in the cloud, but I don't believe in the hype for the cloud. I don't think the cloud's going to solve all our problems. I'm old enough. We had the cloud before, you know, we did. It's called time sharing, for real. It was just like these times we're in now. The country was coming out of Vietnam. We had the oil shock. We had a bad economy. Political instability around the world made businesses super nervous. And today, when I hear people complain about buying a $10,000 or $15,000 server, I mean, I just laugh. In the 70s, you know, we thought a cheap computer cost $200K, right? So people didn't want to spend $1 million for the mainframe, or $2 million or whatever, so they would go rent it. Well, as soon as alternatives became available in the early 80s, time sharing was done by 82, 83. So I don't think the cloud's going to be done, but there's a reason why there's 50 kinds of screwdrivers, right? You get the right tool for what you're doing at the time, and not because somebody tells you it's the latest and greatest. So, questions on this stack? The code or the data? Well, you do have security trimming. That's a good question. I was working with a fairly new client the other day, and they're a financial services firm. And they were kind of giving me some pushback because I was making the best practice recommendation. Hey, you need to tighten this up here. You know, you got a lot of people that can get to this stuff. And I said, you know, the Washington Post, and this was like last Wednesday or something. Last week, the Washington Post printed an article. I used to live in D.C., so I read that paper every day. The Chinese, the DOD announced, had hacked 20 top-secret DOD projects. Well, those dudes spend billions of dollars on security. They got the best heads in the business protecting that stuff. So what does that do to us? Oops. What does that do to us? So you can use the security trimming. You can use VPN and the tools that we have available that we can affordably deploy. When you go multi-tenant, if you go with Office 365, I think they're probably going to do a pretty good job on maintaining your data, but I don't think that they might not be quite as focused on what you need as you would be. So there's a trade-off there. Does that answer that? I don't think it's there yet. You know, we still have I was at a meeting here, and Robert was there a couple weeks back, and this guy goes up to a Microsoft employee, and I want to give you some good feedback, and I could see his face drop. It's like, oh, here we go. And he was talking about what he didn't like and so on. So the guy walks away, and I know him pretty well, and he turns to me and he says, we can't win. We come out with a modest release, we're not innovative. We do something aggressive like SharePoint 2013, Windows 8. We pushed the envelope too far, it wasn't ready. Customers weren't ready. So I think what they're trying to do is gradually move the pile forward. You rarely hear about them getting hacked, Microsoft, and I know they're real serious about it. But you get all this pushback. How many people in here still have XP? Half the room. What would happen to you if you rolled out Windows 8? We call it a resume writing exercise, right? So, I mean, I like Windows 8. I've been running Windows 8 since last August, and I think it's really solid, really good OS. But the point is not how good those of us in this room do something. I mean, I'm just a tool vendor, and if people don't know how to use my tools, I'm out of work. I mean, I don't have anything to do, so we've got to be sensitive, I think, to users. And I think the problem that the big vendors have, if you're paying attention, you have to know security is like super, super critical. Anybody, I don't play games, but anybody here play games? Just the young people. And the semi-young people. So what was it, 2 years ago that hackers took Sony game site down for four or 5 months? You know the story behind that? So Sony detects a hacker on this game site. So Sony says, we're big, we're Sony, we're going to teach them a lesson. So they go after them. Well, a bunch of other hackers get together and they say, we're going to show you. And they take a Fortune 50 company's website down for months. So the tools just aren't there yet. You know, I think they're going to come, but they're just not there yet. Anybody else? The other thing I prepared to show you tonight, and I'll be happy to show you anything that we can on SharePoint 13. Let me get out of this. I want to, my apologies to Robert. He's heard this presentation. So, a little less than a year ago, I'm in another city, and I'm doing a presentation for some Microsoft partners. So it was late, and everybody was tired, and we had a really lively discussion after. And this one guy goes, is a pretty successful IT company. He goes, hey, look, you know, we appreciate you coming and sharing with us and all that, but listen, dude, I don't think any of my customers really need this SharePoint stuff. He said, in fact, one of my customers just spent $100K on new servers and SharePoint licenses, and I don't think they need it. I held my tongue, but I had this mental picture of a customer holding him down and forcing that $100K check in his hand. He said, by the time it's all done, it's probably going to be $200K. So a guy at the back goes, well, how many users? He says, 200. So I want to throw out a business case here. If you think I'm full of it, tell me. So this is what I said. So I said 200K, right? Right. 200 users? Yep. So 200 into 200,000, it's $1,000 per user. Is that right? Yep. System life going to be 4 years? Pretty close. So it's $250 per user per year. Or $20 a month. For about $1 a day. Okay, he says. Well, as Paul Harvey used to say, the other side of the coin is the average person sitting at a computer today doing work in an office costs $100,000 a year. Not my words. Forrester, Gartner, a whole bunch of people have studied this, and that's their number. Since the average person gets paid, you notice I didn't say works, for 2,000 hours a year, if my math is right, that's $50 an hour. I've done a bunch of speaking engagements over the last decade, and periodically I'll ask people, well, how much time do you spend looking for stuff? The average is 2 hours a day. You get everything, but the average is 2 hours a day. So let me put this to you. Is it reasonable that if you set SharePoint up properly, which has a very powerful search engine that's been dramatically enhanced in 2013, can you get back 30 minutes a day of productivity? And you say, yes, no? What's half of 50? Any business school graduates in here? Last time I checked, 25 to 1 is pretty good. And search is not even low-hanging fruit. it's on the ground fruit. And search is just one thing that SharePoint does. Now, a few years ago, see if I can get this machine to cooperate. Microsoft bought this company called Fast. Yeah, let's see if I can get this to cooperate here. And so now with Fast, it purportedly has a competitive engine, search engine to Google. It's got competitive metrics inside of it. But unlike Google, it has relevancy, context-sensitive search, refiners, all configurable by you. In the last release in 2010, if you bought Server, you had to buy Fast Search on top of it for $7K. So now the $7K license for Server includes Fast. So now it's built in. So like I said earlier, if you're using all these features, it's actually cheaper. And let me show you a couple things. So you now have these context-sensitive searches. I don't know if you can see that. That's a web page. And you now have those social networking features built in. So it remembers you and your profile, and it archives your most recent searches and will bring them back if you repeat them and put them in your results list. These are called result sources here that you see. These pages off to the right are configurable. You can define what's there. Those things on the left are called refiners, and you can define those as well. And I'll show you a couple simple ones here. So if I go over here, and I want to edit this page, with the ribbon here, I don't know if you can see these faint blue lines here. Can you all see that in the back? Those are called web part zones. So these are pre-rolled layouts, and you can make your own. Some of you in here are probably a lot more experienced with SharePoint than I am, but for those that are not, if you don't hear anything else I say, never change a master page. Always clone it. You'll be unhappy if you change one. So we can have a lot of different layouts. So you'll see that I've got one here. So I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to delete this guy. And that quickly I can change this page. I can save it back. And so now it's gone. Come back and add that back in. And I'm going to pick this particular location, and I want to insert a web part. Lots and lots of web parts. A lot of them have been dramatically enhanced in this release. And I'm going to pick this search-driven content section and say, let me see the recently changed items. And now you'll see that we're getting a graphical representation of the things we just looked at that were recently changed. But I can tweak this guy. And over here, we actually have a real-time query test engine built into the web part. And you'll see here that we have, this is the result set that we would get. And we can say, don't restrict this by app. In this case, it's not going to change. Specify URL. I can come here and define a refiner. So let's say that there's a facility in 2013 called e-discovery. In America, now, as everybody knows, is the most litigious society on the planet. And so I think this tool that is now built into Enterprise, Microsoft pitches that for that particular thing, but it's really useful for grabbing and cloning data for other things. So you can take this search engine that lives underneath, it's a service that runs in SharePoint, and use it for lots and lots of stuff. So we went out ahead of time and we set up the things we wanted to search. We set up, our local SharePoint sites, we set up a couple file shares, and we actually set up a couple of external websites. And so that search engine is bound underneath, and then we can consume it with these front-end tools. We could go into a particular site where we had a lot of data, and we can create our own result, which would be analogous to a 2010 scope, a narrowing set. We can define how it looks. We can give it a name, and we can pull it from some of these lists. Make sense? So let's just see if it works. We'll say yes. And let's change a couple things, like the properties. And let's say I want to change properties. And how about author? So let me save this. And there is the result set of what we just searched. You can now have video. I'm over time, so I'm going to stop. Any questions?
SharePoint 2010 makes progress in compatibility design and
Oh, it's break? Oh, I thought you were telling me stop. Okay. All right, well, I'll answer his question, then we'll take a break.
I was just wondering if your team was making progress.
Well, I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to move a pretty big pile and not lose very many people. So I think that all the stuff with Office 365, I went to a session about a year back, and they laid out the roadmap to 2020. Their goal from top management all the way down to engineering, like 90% of the software engineers at Microsoft, developers, are working on cloud or web-facing technologies. Their goal by 2020 is everything that they make runs the same in the top 3 or 4 browsers, regardless of where it lives. They're not there yet. But they're way better, like I run this with Chrome, Firefox. Now, I'm not a big fan of IE10, I got to be honest here. Spirit of, it's, I said to one guy, I don't criticize them much because I know their job's pretty hard. How can you guys get the OS so tight and mess up the browser? But it's their first touch browser. So IE11's coming this October. I guess everybody knows 8.1. Be out, free upgrade, whether you have RT or Pro or whatever. So how long is the break? Okay, let's take a break. I'm going to show you something in 2010 here, because I don't have this converted to 2013 yet. Let me log out of this. was it that had written an InfoPath C# app? What did yours do? What did it do? Okay. Okay. Fair enough. So in 2010, this has changed in Visual Studio 2012 works with SharePoint 2013. So in SharePoint 2010 and Visual Studio 2010, you could write C# apps inside of InfoPath Designer without owning Visual Studio. We did an event down in Atlanta, and these two guys from a big manufacturing company about fell off their chair when they saw that. And then you can take that C# app and have a lot of the tools that you get with Visual Studio. Test it, debug it. You can debug it running in Visual Studio. You can debug it running in SharePoint. You can debug it running inside of InfoPath Designer. And you can publish that whole thing back up to the back end of SharePoint as an app. It's centrally managed, and it runs in the browser. So I'm going to bring this up. I did something for the SharePoint users group here, but we just finished this for a client, and they're testing it now. So even though they give me permission to show their stuff, I'm a little queasy about doing it, so I don't. It's a large construction company, and way back, somebody at the AIA come up with this form for how you track and bill large construction jobs. If you saw this form, it wouldn't make any sense. But everybody in the industry uses it that does large projects, and so we had to emulate it. So out in the field, these projects are often remote, and they might be not tethered to a good data source, provider source. So they wanted to have an application, like let's say you're building a bridge somewhere. It might take you a year to do that. And when you bid that project, you have to keep track of things like change orders that happen throughout the contract. And every month you have to remember what happened in the prior month, and you have to roll it forward. And you have to be able to go back and look at that and change that. So the problem that presented was the people in the field are there to build stuff. They're not there to do data entry, but they're the ones that are in touch with the data. So the way we decided to attack that, the client and us, is by taking and building that app. There's several small apps, actually, that live inside of InfoPath forms so that they could render it in the browser. And they went out, I think they were with AT&T. Don't hold me to that. But AT&T, didn't they just do a deal with Samsung for the tablets? Is that them? Anybody know? Well, anyhow, they bought a bunch of tablets that have 3G, 4G in them, and that's what they have in the field. So I'm going to show you this app that kind of illustrates the technology. It's a server, so it takes a minute. Anybody running Windows 12 Virtual Hyper-V production? Anybody? So one of the problems that you have doing this kind of an app is you want to make they wanted a template out of it. So every time they bid a job, they win a job, they close a job, they're all template based. So I want to take this form app and embed it, but I might deploy it to some other URL, and there's no intrinsic tool built inside of InfoPath that will clean that up for us. So that was the first task we had to change, and I'll show you that here in a second. Did you want to share a comment while we're waiting about the conference you went to on security? Because that was better information than I have. Yes, sir. You. Did you want to share a comment about that? Yes, sir. Yep. Yes, sir. I heard earlier today, because of this leak that happened, the NSA, dude, I didn't know this. Did you know that somebody could hack into your smartphone while it's off and activate the speaker and pick up whatever's going on around you? I did not know that. That's like spooky stuff. So here's this little app that we did. So you'll see over here we have this expense report list. I don't have the local logo. We have a detail list. And we have a couple of lookup lists. And you'll see there's some details in here. So if I come over here and decide that I want to add a new document, the first button that has a little bit of code in it is this one here. I think it works. This is running locally, and I think it's a little starved here, so please give me a minute. There you go. So there's a little bit of C# code, and we wanted to have a unique entry for this expense ID because we want to do a couple of additional things. And I mentioned earlier, like we had different approval routes, and you see we have an approval route here called Tech Services. And over there we had list IDs for, various people by their job title. And then we'd have the actual user ID attached to that. So this will look that up and extract that to do the approval. And then here, come over here and go down. I'll just pick a couple items. This is a lookup list. And you can actually do this in code. You don't have to do this with bound list, because when you use a bound list in InfoPath, the URL is static. So if you're going to take and put this in a template and publish it back on the back end of the server and use this as a relative content type throughout your SharePoint form, you're going to have to do something with that URL or it's going to break. So let's say we spent $350 and we used US Air to Orlando. And let's say we rented a car. Oops, made a mistake. And let's say we rented a car. And let's say we stayed in a hotel. So I'm going to save this. Now, I don't have a cert on this, a certificate. And like I said, this was a little illustration of how this works. And so right here, I'm going to submit this, and it just wrote it to the list. And we embedded report services in this form. So if you have Enterprise 2010 or newer, report services also renders reports in the browser. So again, if you are using these services, it'll be cheaper than deploying a lot of tools on the front end, and you'll be able to support more devices. There's a little hack for this, by the way. Report services on demand, and you can put a task in so when it boots up, like every morning, 1 o'clock, it wakes up and loads it and gives it 1,440 minutes to run, so it's always memory resident. Questions on what we just did? While this is coming up, I'm going to go over here and, let's see, I think it was 136, wasn't it? And there's the report. And let me show you how that works. Now you'll notice that I'm not loading Visual Studio. Unfortunately, this is not true in 2013 in Visual Studio 12. So there's our form. And I can come in and look at this picture button and look at the attached code that we have to it. It's going to load up this mini version of Visual Studio. I think this combination of tools is extremely useful because as we get more heterogeneous devices spread around, a lot more mobility, the ability to have multiple devices connect to heavier applications that talk to the back end, I think is going to be increasingly important over time. And just, I know we have one ex-Microsoft guy here. Whoops. Got a little technical problem there. I think this has been undersold. So all this will do is bring up the mini version of Visual Studio with the C# code, hopefully, that attaches to the button. And hopefully this will work. Questions while we're waiting? A third. It's actually lower than. I think it's hard to criticize Microsoft because I think they got a big task, a big job. But some people were ragging me the other day and telling me how bad Microsoft was and how bad Google is, how good Google is. I said, Google better watch out because one of these days Microsoft's going to figure out how to sell some stuff. And when they do, because they've got the deepest bench, in my opinion, in the deepest technology, like this. This is extremely useful. But a lot of people don't know it. You know, they just don't know it, and that's not really difficult to do. The way we write code today, I think, has fundamentally changed. When I started, you'd write a monolithic app, one app that did a lot of stuff. Today, I think the best practice is you stitch together a lot of server-level components that are more robust, more scalable, and more solid than anything you are going to write. The code you write is going to be a little bit more complex because you're pulling together a lot of different sources, but it's going to scale right, it's going to perform right, and it's going to be more maintainable, and you're going to be able to deliver more value for less dollars. Anybody have a different view? Does that sound right? So now here, this came up. There's a breakpoint. There's the methods that we used. And if you come down here and you'll see that we just stepped through, we just stepped through the rows in that table. This is all XML underneath. Straight up XML. And we just stepped through all those rows. We grabbed the variables out of each one of those cells because when you publish this, you can publish this back to SharePoint. Well, that stuff at the top, where we pick the route name and we pick the user and the date, that's a one-off, right? We have one route name, we have one expense date at the top, we have one user. We can push that back into a content type. Everybody familiar with content types? No? Yes? Content type is extremely powerful. It's like an electronic bucket that if you apply the rules properly of how to use a content type, you can put executable code in there. So SharePoint has this architecture underneath, like you can do very sophisticated business intelligence in SharePoint. It's a content type, a series of content types. A content type is a key performance indicator. It's a scorecard, dashboard, all those terms. This is a content type. This whole thing came in as a content type. So when we went over into this site with all this code, just let me know when I'm done here, will you? I'm going to minimize this. And in this site, let me go back to the site we were in. I'm going to close the form, and I'll say no. And if we go into the document library, and we go into library settings, and we come over here to, whoops. I want to do this. We have this setting here called Advanced that allows us to turn on the ability to include pre-rolled functions. And we've enabled it, and once you have that enabled, then you can add things down here. Whoops. And you'll see that is a content type. So instead of me having to pre-allocate and define all the stuff, even the rows that were, the data columns that were pushed back in, that was all done in InfoPath. But now InfoPath has a problem. When we put those expense items line by line in there, there's no way that InfoPath or SharePoint knows how many we're going to have. So when we tell it to create a content type, which is a very simple command, I'm running out of time here, we can't tell it to bring that data back because it doesn't know how many we're going to push back. So we added code here to push it back into an individual list. And the header data was pushed back into the form list. That's all in the content type. So I could take this content type to another list and just enable it because it's global and turn it on, and all that stuff would be present. And we added code in here that remaps that URL problem we talked about. I hope I didn't get too geeky here. Any questions before we wrap up? Well, thank you for being patient and allowing me to speak.